Stephen, thanks for joining me this afternoon. Most Sydney-siders or Victorians who have been in Sydney will be allowed back into Victoria from 6 o'clock tonight. This announcement was overdue, wasn't it?
Well, look, I think with the controversy that's been swirling around the tennis players and the access for so the Australian Open could get underway, I think Andrews really had no choice but to vote as he's done a few days ago. Ease the Brisbane restrictions and now the Sydney restrictions. The pressure was really building on the Premier around the willingness to facilitate, people with COVID being allowed into Australia to play tennis when thousands of Victorians have been stranded across the borders, both in Queensland and in New South Wales. So I'm sure every one of those will cheer. I've had a family friend who's been trapped across, visited Brisbane to see his family and his wife's family. And they went a week before Christmas. They've still been there. I think they'll finally be able to start heading home shortly. So, yes, overdue, and I think a very clever political move to avoid what was a growing backlash in Victoria.
It would be frustrating for the Victorians who've just spent 2 weeks in hotel quarantine only to learn that now the borders opened up. What should the government be doing to support them?
Yeah, look, the decisions that were made and people have been complying with, and then suddenly, okay, everyone can come back and all they need is a COVID test and they're free. I mean, I would think that a way forward for the Victorian Health Department will be to say the same sort of principle. If you have a COVID test now and you can get a clear, you would potentially be allowed out. Now, you need to look at where they're from. And certainly there have been people who have come back from regional New South Wales where there's been no reported cases of COVID. So I don't think you can make it 100% because there's still people who might have been in some of those genuine red zones before the full border was closed that might still need a longer period in quarantine. But certainly I think there's going to be more and more calls for there to be a shift in the way that people who are actually in the quarantine are treated at the moment.
It's been a chaotic time for thousands of families. Let's talk about the tennis. 72 tennis players are in a hard lockdown. Many of them fear that they're going to be disadvantaged at the Australian Open and have been critical of the way this has all been handled. Do you think they have a fair point? Do you think the government could have handled this better?
Well, the protocols that have been in place have been agreed by the players, the representatives, the tennis federations, international and locally. The rules have been consistently applied. In the same way, some players have been complaining about the hard lockdown. They knew that before they agreed to get on those planes. It is, very bad luck. Will they be disadvantaged? No question. And this is the current state of the world. But, I mean, you've seen the sort of debacle that Novak Djokovic was engaged in last year when he ran a tournament and people ended up being quite badly affected by COVID. And Australia has been a measure around the world about how to deal with this. So those players are showing a little bit of ungratefulness that the Victorian government's been bending over backwards to ensure that the tournament goes ahead, but it's not prepared to endanger the safety of the Victorian public and the Australian public, and they should stick to their guns.
Okay. Well, Labor could lose 2 seats in the Hunter Valley, according to a new poll. Is this a wake-up call for Anthony Albanese?
Well, I think there's a very active debate in the Labor Party at the moment about our climate policy, our greenhouse policy, and the definition of insanity is to take the same position and do it over and over again and expect to get a different answer. We've now been through 2013 election, 2016 election, 2019 election, and our primary vote has essentially been going backwards, and particularly backwards in the states that have a resource base, so Queensland and WA, and clearly parts of New South Wales from these polls also are reflected in that. So Albo's a smart bloke. He knows that he needs to reposition on some of these issues. He might not want to go as far as Joel perhaps would want to go, but I think that there is a general realisation that Labor has to take a different policy position going forward to, if it wants to be competitive in the next election federally. So I expect there continue to be a robust debate. But the sort of result you're seeing at the moment would be a very disappointing for Labor Party if that was the outcome when the election's held. And yes, there's lots of speculation that there's a big window of opportunity for Scott Morrison to have an election in September, October. So the Labor Party has to do some hard thinking between now and then about what position it wants to take forward.
Okay. Look, I want to talk to you about the US. Joe Biden's inauguration's coming up in just a couple of days.
Oh, thank God.
Security
thank God.
has been ramped up, but how do you suspect this will play out?
Oh, look, I think it's terribly disappointing. I've been talking to some of my friends, both on the Republican and Democrat this morning in the US, and they're excited by losing Trump, but the fact that so many National Guard are needed to protect the events, not just in DC, but around the country. I mean, these aren't being put in place to protect from jihadists, international terrorists, or bad actors. These are being put in place to defend themselves from insurrectionists, the MAGA mob that Trump has whipped up to a frenzy with the lie about fraud. And you just got to look at a report that's been released from all of the intelligence agencies today, which makes it very clear that the factless claims of fraud, where there's no basis for them, have whipped up this hysteria in the domestic extremist terrorist camps. And so I find it incredibly depressing, as do my friends on both sides of the chamber in the US, that this sort of preparation is needed to protect them from American citizens.
And Stephen, what's your prediction for Joe Biden's first few weeks in office?
I think he's going to be really busy. He's announced a pretty big set of to-do lists, from the Paris Climate Treaty to a range of presidential resolutions which will overturn all of the Trump signature documents. So Biden is wasting no time. It's going to be a very fast first 10 days, and I suspect a very pacey first 100 days. He will want to absolutely settle down a whole range of issues, from China to climate to the COVID and the debacle that has been the rollout, never mind just the ignoring of it, but the actual rollout of the COVID vaccine in the US has been beyond embarrassing. So it's got a big ticket of work to get underway from Thursday afternoon.
Interesting and challenging time ahead. Stephen Conroy, really appreciate your time this afternoon.
Great to talk with you.